They said even ancient Rome, with all its cruelty, would never allow what Constantinople celebrated nightly. Yet, in the heart of the Byzantine Empire, beneath the glowing torches of the Hippodrome, a child was about to be thrown to the mercy of an empire that mistook pain for entertainment. From this world of noise and cruelty would rise the most dangerous woman in history, Empress Theodora. But before she wore purple silk and ruled beside an emperor, she was just a frightened girl whose life was sold for survival. Her story begins with the death of one man, her father, and the chain reaction that turned childhood trauma into political mastery. In the year 504 CE, Constantinople was no ordinary city. It pulsed like a living organism, divided by two colossal factions, the Blues and the Greens. These weren't sports teams. Were full-blown political machines. They controlled jobs, wealth, the courts, and even people's destinies. Everyone belonged to one of them. And for Theodora's father, Acacius, that allegiance meant everything. He worked as a bear-keeper for the Greens, training the massive beasts that entertained 80,000 roaring spectators inside the Hippodrome. His position wasn't glamorous, but it guaranteed food, protection, and a small slice of stability for his wife and 3 young daughters. Until, suddenly, he died. In a world where a man's faction defined his family's survival, Acacius's death was catastrophic. By law, his position and salary should have passed to his widow so she could support their children. But law meant nothing when corruption ruled. A man named Asterius, the Greens, dancing master, essentially the entertainment manager of the faction, accepted a bribe and gave the job to someone else. Overnight, Theodora's mother went from being the wife of a faction official to a desperate widow with no income, 3 starving daughters, and nowhere to turn. She pleaded with the Greens, begging them to follow their own rules, but the faction turned its back on her completely. In desperation, she turned to their rivals the Blues who, despite being political enemies, still had the power to show mercy. What she did next would forever scar her children's souls. She took her daughters to the Hippodrome, dressed them in ceremonial wreaths like supplicants, and presented them before the jeering crowd. It wasn't just a plea for help, it was an unspoken advertisement. In that one act, a mother surrendered her children to the brutal entertainment system that fed Constantinople's endless appetite for spectacle. The crowd that day saw not 3 frightened girls, but 3 new performers for an empire addicted to degradation. Among them was 10-year-old Theodora. From that day forward, the Hippodrome became both her prison and her classroom. She was thrust into the empire's underbelly, where children were trained not just to perform, but to obey. What began as theater quickly became exploitation disguised as art. Theodora's earliest lessons weren't in reading or arithmetic. They were in survival. She learned how power could be purchased, how cruelty could be masked as entertainment, and how men's desires shaped the destiny of the powerless. While most children her age were learning to write, she was learning to endure. But even as a child, Theodora was different. Where others broke under the humiliation, she observed. Every performance became an experiment. Every encounter, a study in human weakness. She watched as the same men who ruled the city lost control of themselves in the shadows of the Hippodrome. She saw senators and merchants trade their dignity for moments of pleasure, revealing their fears and insecurities in ways that no tutor or philosopher could ever teach. Without realizing it, the empire had built her education system. Theodora wasn't being destroyed, she was being trained. As the years passed, she became one of Constantinople's most talked about performers. The crowds cheered, the coins rained down, but inside she was taking notes. She learned that emotion could be weaponized, that vulnerability could disarm, and that beauty wasn't just a curse, it was a tool. By the time she reached 16, she had turned survival into strategy. The same stage that once humiliated her became the theater where she began crafting the persona that would someday command an empire. Then came the man who would change everything, Hezbollah, the powerful governor of Libya. When he visited Constantinople, he saw Theodora perform and was immediately captivated. He offered her what seemed like an escape, to leave the brutal city behind and live in luxury as his companion. For a girl who had spent her youth fighting for scraps of safety, it sounded like salvation. She accepted, believing she was finally free of the darkness that had haunted her childhood. But she soon discovered the gilded cages are still cages. Life in the governor's palace in Libya was comfortable, but it came with invisible chains. Hesebolas was a man used to control, and Theodora quickly realized that freedom in his house was only an illusion. Yet, instead of surrendering, she studied him the way she had studied the crowds of the Hippodrome. Every conversation, every argument, every indulgence revealed something deeper about how power worked not through armies or wealth, but through the psychology of dependence. She discovered that those who seem powerful are often the most fragile when their desires are exposed, but even the most calculated manipulation has its limits. When Theodora began influencing his political decisions subtly at first, through conversation and persuasion, Hesebolas realized he was no longer in control. His pride turned to rage. One night, in a fit of fury, he cast her out. Theodora found herself alone once more, standing barefoot in the desert sand, the luxury she thought she'd earned reduced to dust. For many, this would have been the end. For her, it was the turning point. She began the long journey back to Constantinople, crossing seas and cities, surviving by any means necessary. But this time she was not a frightened child. She was a strategist. Every stop became another lesson. On merchant ships, she learned the economics of trade and corruption. Among sailors, she learned to read fear and loyalty. In foreign ports, she saw how faith, politics, and desire intertwined to control entire populations. Piece by piece, she was assembling the blueprint for the empire she would one day dominate. Her journey led her to Alexandria, where she encountered the teachings of a different kind of power faith. She converted to Monophysite Christianity, not as a spiritual awakening, but as a political revelation. For the first time, she saw how belief could bind people stronger than gold or fear. Religion, she realized, was the ultimate form of control, and she intended to master it. By the time she returned to Constantinople, Theodora was no longer a victim. She was a woman who had studied the anatomy of power in all its forms: sexual, political, psychological, and spiritual. Rumors of her intelligence and cunning had already spread through the capital. Whispers of a woman who had outsmarted a governor reached the ears of the most powerful man in Byzantium, Prince Justinian. What neither of them knew was that their meeting would ignite one of history's most dangerous partnerships. She had survived her past. Now she was ready to weaponize it. Constantinople glittered like a crown above the sea, its golden domes gleaming in the morning light as Theodora's ship entered the harbor. For her, every shimmer of sunlight was a reminder of the city that had once abandoned her. She returned not as the desperate child who had begged for pity, but as a woman who had mastered the art of turning pain into strategy. The Hippodrome, the arena that had once devoured her innocence, stood in the distant silent now, but still echoing with the roar of crowds that once cheered her suffering. She looked at it with cold defiance. The city that had destroyed her was about to kneel before her. Rumors of her intelligence and strange charisma had already spread among the political elite. They whispered about the woman who had survived Libya, who could outwit governors and charm scholars, who had turned misfortune into education. In the world of Byzantine politics, reputation was currency, and Theodora was becoming rich. So when she was invited to an aristocratic gathering, the event that would alter the course of history, it wasn't by accident. It was by design. Among the guests was a man in his 40s, with sharp eyes and an even sharper mind. Justinian, nephew of Emperor Justin. He was no ordinary prince. He had risen through intellect, not birthright. Yet for all his ambition and vision, he was known to be solitary, consumed by law and theology rather than pleasure. But the moment he saw Theodora, something within him shifted. Here stood a woman unlike anyone he had ever met, graceful, yet dangerous, intelligent, yet unpredictable. Their first conversation wasn't flirtation, it was a duel. Words clashed like swords, each testing the other's defenses. And though Justinian had debated senators and theologians, he found himself outmatched by the former performer who could read emotions like scripture. For Theodora, this encounter was no coincidence. It was an opportunity. She recognized Justinian's greatest weakness almost immediately. His need for connection, for admiration, for someone who saw not just the prince, but the man behind the laws. While others flattered him with empty praise, she challenged him, questioned him, made him think. It wasn't seduction, it was psychological chess, and like every opponent she had ever faced, he never saw the trap being set. Weeks turned into months, and their relationship deepened. What began as fascination grew into an unbreakable bond. Justinian admired her intellect and respected her insight. She, in turn, saw in him the instrument of her destiny, the man who could raise her from the ashes of her past to the pinnacle of empire. Yet their union was unthinkable. Theodora's past as an entertainer made her legally unfit for marriage to a noble, let alone a future emperor. Byzantine law was clear. Once an actress, always an actress. No reform, no forgiveness. But Justinian was no ordinary man, and his obsession with Theodora was no ordinary affection. He was willing to rewrite the laws of an empire for her. The court was horrified. Senators sneered, priests protested, and whispers filled the corridors of the palace. To them, Theodora wasn't a future empress, she was a living scandal, a reminder of the city's underworld. Yet every insult, every attempt to shame her, only made her stronger. She had been mocked before. She had been humiliated before. And every time, she had learned to turn humiliation into control. Standing between her and the throne was one immovable obstacle: Empress Euphemia, Justin's wife, a former slave who had clawed her way to power. Euphemia saw her younger reflection in Theodora, but where she had survived through loyalty, Theodora thrived through manipulation. Euphemia despised her. "I rose from chains," she is said to have told the court, "but I was never a disgrace." She blocked the marriage, using her influence over Emperor Justin to keep the couple apart. For Theodora, this was more than rejection, it was war. Then, as suddenly as she had appeared, Euphemia was gone. Dead in her sleep. No warning, no illness, just silence. The palace whispered of divine will, but some suspected something far more deliberate. Theodora had learned many things during her years of survival: how to read men, how to control them, and perhaps how to remove those who stood in her way. No one could prove anything, yet the timing was too perfect to ignore. Within days, Emperor Justin passed a new decree allowing men of senatorial rank to marry women of former entertainer status. The law was so specific, so narrowly written, that everyone knew who it was meant for. Theodora's path to the throne was clear. In 525 CE, under the vast dome of Hagia Sophiae, the girl who once performed for coins walked down an aisle of marble and gold. Draped in imperial purple, she became Empress Theodora, wife and equal to Justinian. The crowds outside cheered, but many did so through gritted teeth. To the nobility, it was an outrage. To the people who had once mocked her, it was unthinkable. But to Theodora, it was justice. The same city that had thrown her family to the streets now bowed before her. The empire that once used her body now answered to her mind. Yet beneath the celebration, something darker stirred. Justinian's love for Theodora was absolute, so absolute it began to shape his rule. He relied on her judgment in every major decision, from law to religion to foreign policy. And she, in turn, wielded that influence with precision. Those who crossed her found themselves exiled, disgraced, or mysteriously silenced. Ear-rise, wasn't he? Just a love story, it was the ascension of a survivor who had learned that mercy was a weakness. Theodora had mastered the language of domination, and now, seated beside the emperor, she would use it to reshape the world. Her enemies whispered that she was manipulating him, that the empire was ruled not from the throne but from the empress's private chambers. Maybe they were right. Theodora understood Justinian in ways no advisor could. She knew his fears, his pride, his insecurities. She could calm his storms and ignite his fury with a single word. Together, they became the most formidable duo Byzantium had ever seen. But their partnership, forged in passion and ambition, would soon face the test of fire. 7 years into their reign, the empire was trembling. Corruption festered, taxes rose, and public resentment reached a breaking point. The factions that once divided the city, the Blues and the Greens, finally united, not in sport, but in hatred. The streets erupted with rage, and a single chant echoed through the city: Nicomedean Conca. It was more than a riot. It was an attempt to erase everything Theodora represented. They weren't. They weren't just rebelling against the emperor. They were demanding the death of the woman who had climbed from the lowest depths to the highest throne. As flames devoured the city and mobs filled the streets, panic spread through the palace. Advisors urged Justinian to flee. There is no shame in survival. They told him, save yourself while you can. For a moment, even the emperor wavered. The ships were ready, the treasure loaded, the escape route open. But before he could move, a calm voice broke the chaos. Theodora rose from her seat, her gaze steady, her voice cutting through the panic like steel. My opinion, she said, is that this is no time for flight. Those who have worn the purple should never live to see themselves without it. If death must come, it is better to die as a ruler than to live as a coward. The room fell silent. In that moment, she wasn't speaking as a wife, or even as a queen. She was speaking as a survivor who had faced death 1,000 times before. Justinian looked into her eyes and saw not fear, but fire. The same fire that had burned in the child who refused to break. Her words changed everything. Theodora had just given history one of its most defining moments. The emperor who had been ready to run now, prepared to fight. And the decision that followed would drown the Hippodrome, the very place where Theodora's nightmare began, in the blood of 30,000 people.